example so you understand how they are used. So let's say there is Bank of America, which is a commercial bank, right? And this bank has depositors. So people who've got, let's say, term deposits in this bank, and they've put in this money for a long amount of time, and what they expect is a decent fixed rate of return on these deposits. What Bank of America is doing is giving out loans to companies, and those companies are paying interest to Bank of America, but this interest is based on a floating rate. And what that means is, which is the prevailing interest rate in the market, depending on what the Federal Reserve sets the prevailing rate of interest. Now here's the problem. Bank of America is getting a floating rate, but they have to pay a fixed rate. So they're in a bit of a fix. How to solve this situation? Now, Bank of America is a commercial bank, right? So let's say they go to an investment bank, a specialized investment bank. So let's say IB. And what they could do is they could get into a swap with this IB where they take these floating payments that they are getting. So they give them the floating payments, and they get from the IB fixed payments, which they can conveniently then forward to the depositors. So this is what is a swap, where there are two counterparties. One pays a fixed rate and the other pays a market reference rate. And the fixed rate pair is, so in our previous example, Bank of America is paying the floating rate to the investment bank, right? And the investment bank is giving them the fixed rate, which they can conveniently then give to their depositors. So this is basically one of the most common types of swaps, which is called an interest rate swap, where a fixed rate is exchanged for a floating interest rate, and the one that is paying the floating rate is called the floating rate pair, so no surprise there, and the one that is paying the fixed rate is called the fixed rate pair. Now there are a few important things that you need to know, and the main thing over here is the netting of the payment. So let's say the IB is paying a fixed rate of 5%, right? And the notional amount is 100 million. So that is the loan amount. And the period is 1 year. So 5% on 100 million for a 1 year period will be 5 million, right? So the IB needs to pay Bank of America 5 million, whereas Bank of America is paying the floating rate, which let's say happens to be 4% right now. So 4% into the notional principal of 100 million, which is the loan amount, and multiplied by the period, let's say 1 year. So this happens to come to 4 million. So Bank of America has to actually pay 4 million, whereas the investment bank has to pay to Bank of America 5 million. But they're not going to pay each other these 4 million and 5 million. They're just going to net off the payments, and only a payment of 1 million will be done, which is just the net difference, right? Instead of one party paying the whole 5 million and the other party paying the 4 million, they'll just keep it simple, and only the 1 million difference will be given to the party that has to get the higher amount. Now, this is done every period. So this is the difference, whichever party has to get the higher amount, is settled every period, and that is what we call the swap resetting every period. Now you might be thinking why the investment bank is doing what they are doing, why they are taking the floating rate from Bank of America and why they have agreed to pay them a fixed rate. Because usually what happens is that they might need to do that, because they might have a completely opposite situation where maybe they've got a fixed rate coming in from somewhere and they need to pay a floating out. So instead of using their money and investing in bonds that would give them a floating rate, they could just get into a swap. So both parties actually needed the opposite situation and they just swapped their cash flows instead of having to go out in the market and invest in bonds that would then give them the cash flows that they needed to pay out. And let me give you a practical example here. So let's say there's a company, Filton Investments, and Filton Investments would like to pay a floating rate. So this MRR is the market reference rate, and this is floating, and they want to pay this floating rate and they would like to receive a fixed rate because they want to pay their depositors a fixed rate, right? So what's happening over here, the fixed rate is 2.25 and this is semi-annual. So 2.25 divided by 2 and the notional principal is 200 million. So the notional amount, which is the amount of the swap, is 200 million. So 2.25 divided by 2 multiplied by the 200 million gives you 2.25 million, which is the amount that Filton should receive, the total amount that Filton should receive, which is 2,250,000. Whereas Filton has agreed to pay the floating rate, which happens to be 1.95. And that is less than 2.25. So 1.95 divided by 2 multiplied by the notional amount of 200 million comes to 1,950,000. Now, as you can see, 1,950 is less than what they are going to or supposed to receive, which is 2,250. So Filton should receive more than they have to pay. But they are not going to pay the 1,950 and receive the 2,250. What they are going to do is just receive the difference, which is 2,250,000 minus 1,950,000, 300,000. So these payments will be cancelled out and Filton will receive only 300,000 British pounds. So this is what is a interest rate swap being settled at every period, and this settlement will be done at every pre-agreed period, whether that is 6 months or depending on the swap, it could be yearly or quarterly. And that is it for swaps for this learning module.